I'd like to start by taking a moment to recognize the many Indigenous nations who have long-standing relationships with the territories on which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. I think it's important for us to always remember as we start our sessions that we are on land that has a history of displacement, and as forced displacement scholars, we need to acknowledge the local displacements that have happened in Canada historically and continue to happen today. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders in Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I recognize that this territory is subject to the District of Spoon and One without a covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome you today to welcome our friend and colleague, Niloufar Pourzand, who has been teaching at York part-time since 2016. She was the inaugural professor of practice at the Center for Refugee Studies. She also teaches at the Monk Center for Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of Toronto as a visiting professor at Manchester Metropolitan University. Niloufar has come to York University, or did come to York University after 30+ years with the United Nations UNICEF, and has worked and lived in many different countries as an international development humanitarian practitioner and teacher. He has a PhD in sociology, gender, and ethnic studies. Niloufar continues to be engaged with various civil society organizations and social movements with a focus on women's rights, children's rights, refugee rights, and human rights in Iran and Israel. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to speak today about the Plight of Afghans in Iran, the complex, gender, socio-political, and cultural questions of Fraught and critical relationships. It happens, and a carpet cleaner. Yes, in the background. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you, Professor Heine, Michelle Miller, colleagues and friends for joining us online and in person. Thanks to some of my students, past and present, who are also with us. I have been associated with the Center for Refugee Studies, as you mentioned, now for over 2 decades, and did some of my PhD work as a visiting PhD scholar in one of the rooms here around the year 2002 on Afghan women refugees in Pakistan, actually. So over 20 years back. And was also a member of York University's Women in Conflict Zones Network, coordinated by Professor Binara Giles, at that time the director of the Center for Refugee Studies, bringing in the perspectives from Afghanistan and Iran, and was keenly following developments with the center's their project, borderless higher education for refugee, and Hayul is here today. She has been very much part of that, also initiated by Professor Giles. In any case, it has been some years since I've given a talk at the Center for Refugee Studies. The last time was in 2006, when Professor Jennifer Hyman had invited me to be the inaugural professor of practice at the center. So I'm very happy to be back here at CRS. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm indeed particularly grateful for the opportunity to share with you in brief my perspectives about a topic very close to my heart. At the same time, I'm also very sad that it has to be the occasion to discuss such a profoundly difficult and heartbreaking subject. One about the unjust pain and suffering of other human beings, those for which we as a collective have responsibilities towards. Whereas those concerned with refugees and refugee rights, like all of us around the table, whether as Iranians or Iranians in the diaspora, as activists, feminists, and otherwise. I'm sharing these issues with you as an Iranian Canadian, as a former UN staff member, including for the Afghanistan office from 1997 to 2002, as an activist, feminist, an academic, professor, and perhaps I hope a friend and ally of Afghans. I have had connections with Afghanistan since childhood, when my father was an Iranian diplomat in Pakistan, and we had Afghan friends, and visited Kabul in the 1960s for the first time as a child. And then I did my MA and PhD in Afghanistan with travel inside the country, including when my husband Sirus was posted in Mazar Sharif with UNHCR, and worked for UNICEF Afghanistan for 5 years, 1997 to 2002, the first time that Taliban was in power, frequently visiting various provinces of the country. Just to give you a bit of a background about my connections with Afghanistan and where I am coming from. I'm here to share and condemn what is happening and has happened to hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees in Iran. More than 1.5 million Afghan refugees and migrants have been sent back in 2025, according to the United Nations International Organization for Migration, IOM. While the Red Cross says more than 1 million people more could be sent back by the end of the year. These mass deportations, which go against all human rights principles and international agreements, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Convention on Rights of Children, Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and the Refugee Convention. In a more recent article dated 17 October, the official number of deportees from Iran to Afghanistan has been given as 2 million. Imagine 2 million human beings like you and I have forcefully been deported in such a short time. These deportations accelerated immediately after the recent 12-day war of Israel and the US, 13 to 24 June 2025, during which over 901,000 innocent Iranians and also some Afghan refugees living in Iran were killed, and thousands of homes, hospitals were also destroyed. In addition to the military and political targets, including senior Iranian Revolutionary Guard, IRGC officials, and scientists engaged with Iran's nuclear installations. And by now, the government has somewhat achieved its goals with the deportations, which began after the war in June. And they have slowed down, but not stopped by any means. I, like most Iranians, and there's some of us in this room, of course, condemn this war and attacks of the US and Israel in the strongest way possible. And in spite of my and our opposition to the policies and actions of the Iranian regime, I and we believe that the future of Iran and any changes should be determined only by Iranians themselves, and we will never support or endorse or be silent in the face of foreign aggression against our country. Afghans have been coming to Iran seasonally and otherwise at all times, way before the conflicts began in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And the arrival of, at times, up to 4 and even 6, and some people even say up to 10 million Afghans to Iran at certain peak periods. The country shared and shares a long border, history, many aspects of each other's culture and language. Though not all Iranians, nor all Iranians or Afghans are Persian or Dari speaking, nevertheless, it is the lingua franca in both countries. The ties between the two countries are very strong, especially in the border provinces and areas. Some of you might have heard that there are thousands of Iranian women married to Afghan men, mostly from low-income families in the provincial areas, border areas. I could share many stories about the hard lives of some of these women and their family, having met some of them also inside Afghanistan. But let me suffice by saying that finally, after decades of advocacy by various organizations, these women, Iranian women, married to Afghan men, can now conditionally pass on their citizenship to their children. Obtaining citizenship for children is, however, not automatic and requires a security check of the child and his or her father by intelligence organizations, as well as other legal processes. So it is still a very complex process, and most such families still live in limbo, unfortunately, and therefore are also adversely affected by these deportations. So if you are deported as an Afghan man and your wife was Iranian and you have children, those children probably still do not have Iranian identity cards or nationality. Iran is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol. It deposited its instrument of accession in 1976 with reservations on certain articles. Iran, like Pakistan, another neighboring country of Afghanistan, has often been the number one or number two country hosting refugees in the world. I often share with my students that while countries like Iran and Pakistan have hosted up to 6 or even 10 million refugees for decades, we see Western and global North countries and their politicians raising such an uproar over much smaller, insignificant number of refugees, in fact. Life for Afghans has never been easy in Iran or Pakistan, where I've also lived for 5 years. And there have always been many restrictions on them. And unfortunately, some degree of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. There have been ups and downs, and at times the situation has been a bit better, and at times a bit or much worse for them, for various reasons, including domestic political reasons, and surely at times international and UN, UNHCR mediation. But nevertheless, what is a fact is that several generations of Afghans have been born in Iran, raised in Iran, lived, worked, studied, got married, had children, grown old, and died in Iran without ever having set foot in Afghanistan. Many of them are effectively stateless, yet are not officially recognized under this category of refugees. They do not possess Afghan ID cards and cannot obtain them, as there is no record of them or even their families or their fathers within Afghanistan's civil registry system. Only one of the many challenges they face after such deportations. For example, here in Toronto, I know a young Afghan brother and sister who came as refugees from Greece through Iran to Greece to Canada, supported by an NGO a few years ago. They were both born in Iran, have never visited Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is as foreign to them as it is for most of you or us. These millions of Afghans have also contributed immensely to Iran and its economy through their hard labor, including in the construction and agricultural sector, as low-wage workers, as tailors, as grave diggers, and so much more. I am reminded of an Afghan poet in Iran who wrote a beautiful and moving piece, and I don't remember the exact words, but the meaning was, "It is our hands that has built your homes and towns, and yet this is how you behave towards us and our children." Afghans also, these millions of Afghans have been consumers in Iran, contributing to the economy at a time when Iran has faced the largest number of sanctions ever imposed on a country in history. Some have become university students and graduates, artists, writers, actors, doctors, teachers, and otherwise, and have contributed immensely to Iran's cultural milieu. As of late 2024, before the deportations, there were over 60,000 Afghan university students in Iran, according to official Iranian figures. This number is considered unprecedented and is the number of Afghan students has surpassed that of Kabul, students in Kabul. So there are more Afghan university students in Iran than they are in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. So this rich and varied contribution of Afghans in Iran has not often enough been spoken about, unfortunately. For example, just last month at TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival, I met Ferishte Hosseini, an Iranian-born Afghan actress who is now quite well known in Iran and married to one of our best actors, Navid Mohammadzadeh, and both continue to live and work in Iran. She was here with the director, an Iranian woman, to introduce a movie called Between Dreams and Hope about a lesbian couple and their struggles in Iran. A very bold movie and theme for Iran, you would agree. But Iran, sadly, like a number of other countries in the world, in the region, including Pakistan, has also engaged in economic practices that are immensely unfair and unjust towards Afghans. For example, it has encouraged investment from individuals fleeing Afghanistan after Taliban returned to power in 2021, only to later change policies and prevent those investors from withdrawing their money and assets, leaving them empty-handed and unable to recover their money. At times, some Afghans in Iran have also sadly got involved in the political oppressive policies of the regime, including by fighting in the region, such as in Syria during Assad's time, under the rubric of Lashkar Fatemiyun, in exchange for promises for higher pay and being given legal status in the country. Of course, this has always been a very small minority of Afghans, and the majority have been busy enough trying to make ends meet and survive, and have not supported such policies and action by any means. Nevertheless, it is an argument used at times to weaken empathy for the plight of Afghans in Iran. After the recent Israeli-US attacks, unsubstantiated news circulated that some Afghans assisted the Israelis in achieving their military goals in Iran. Though, of course, their knowledge of sensitive regime intelligence matter must have been limited at any point in time, and the most serious damage would have come from Iranian infiltrators close to the regime rather than Afghans. And in fact, officials later said that not a single case was verified. Nevertheless, for reasons we are not sure, but perhaps to realize the plan they had in mind for some time, or to distract public opinion and international eyes of internal suppression of opponents and civil society organization and others, or perhaps to divide and rule. Especially in the immediate weeks following the war, there has been an extremely aggressive and inhuman process of harassment, arrest, and expulsion of, as I mentioned, perhaps up to 2 million Afghans. Fining heavily any Iranian that hired Afghans or housed them. In the 16 days after the conflict with Israel and US, according to the United Nations, what transpired was one of the largest forced movements of population this decade, actually. In an Al Jazeera article, it said that Iran has been building a wall along its massive eastern border with Afghanistan and Pakistan to stem the flow of irregular migration and smuggle drugs and fuel. The parliament is also planning for a new national migration organization that would take over its efforts to crack down on irregular migration. These deportations have led to terribly tragic situations, including separated children, loss of any and all savings and income, arrest upon return to Afghanistan by Taliban in some cases, and absolute destitution and suffering. As many homes in Iran are acquired under a RAN system, where Afghan refugees like Iranians have to pay large sums of money up front, in exchange for housing, landlords are now often unwilling or unable to return these funds. In many cases, this represents the life saving of Afghan refugees and families lost forever upon these expulsions. This is besides the fact that upon return to Afghanistan, and for many it is not a return since they were never in the country in the first place, many will no longer be able to go to school or receive medical care or otherwise. More or many of the young girls deported to Afghanistan will face early or even forced marriage due to a lack of access to education and economic opportunities in what has been called by the UN and others a gender apartheid regime. Can you imagine being a girl in high school or even university and being sent back to Taliban-run Afghanistan and having to stay at home if you have a home, with very limited and restricted mobility and no hope to continue or finish your education? Young boys, on the other hand, may face significant challenges and in some cases may be recruited by armed groups or the de facto government, which also holds extreme ideological positions. Many were born in Iran and only speak Farsi, Dari, and have never been to Afghanistan before and are in fact foreign to the country, as mentioned. For Hazara minorities, who are mostly Shiite Muslims, like most Iranians, it is even harder and they face additional discrimination. Many Hazaras have been targeted and even killed. Mai Sato, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran, is among 4 special rapporteurs who have decried these mass deportations, adding their voice to human rights organizations such as Amnesty International. Sato has said that Afghanistan remains unsafe under Taliban rule. These mass returns violate international law and put vulnerable people, especially women, children, and minorities, at severe risk of persecution and violence. Unfortunately, this has happened, maybe not coincidentally, when Pakistan has also been carrying out similar policies and forced deportations of Afghans. In addition to aerial bombardments of some border areas and the killing of innocent Afghans, including children. You might have heard in the news a few days ago that the 2 countries have reached a ceasefire in these border aggressions. The Pakistani government has been sending drones to border areas. In response, it claims to attacks by the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan militant group, which operates from sanctuaries across the Afghan border. Amongst many rights-based organizations, Amnesty has also expressed a serious concern over these escalated border attacks. And we hope that the recent ceasefire holds, as civilians are those that suffer, both Afghans as well as Pakistanis. Unfortunately, though a number of progressive Iranian organizations and groups, and I know that pattern is the same in Pakistan through activist Pakistani friends, including some of our prominent feminists and individuals like myself in Iran and in the diaspora, have spoken up against these expulsions and human refugee rights violations. But there has not been a mass protest by Iranians, and there are even some who support such actions for various reasons, falling for their xenophobic, racist propaganda, or indifferent. We have much work to do in this regard, and the recent events have resulted in what some of us Iranians would say is shameful behavior, which bears heavily on our conscience as Iranian and will continue to haunt us, which is one reason I'm here to share and discuss with you. Millions of Iranians were mobilized and moved by the death and killing of Mahsa Jina Amini 3 years back, a young Iranian Kurdish woman arrested for her hijab and found in a coma after a short detention and later tragically died. And as many of you know, this shaped the woman life freedom movement, but we have not always been able to articulate this movement in an inclusive enough manner to also include the rights of Afghans and Afghan girls and women in Iran, or back in Afghanistan, unfortunately. Or for that matter, also the rights of Palestinian girls and women in view of the Israeli genocide of the past 2 years in Gaza and its dire consequence of girls and women. So in that sense, you can say I'm a bit critical that not enough of us Iranians who have supported the women life freedom movement have expanded its definition to include other girls and women in neighboring countries as well. Of course, this response or lack of response from many Iranians is happening at a time when Iranians themselves are facing the trauma of this recent war, worries about it resuming, economic hardships, and the acceleration of the regime's harsh treatment. But our fates are interlinked in many ways, Afghans and Iranians. And there is no positive way forward unless Afghans in Iran are also treated humanly and according to international refugee law. It is also happening when there is immense pressure on Afghan refugees in Pakistan, as well as mentioned, and other geopolitical dynamics, and also xenophobic and anti-refugee policies and actions in the global north, US, many European countries, and a dramatic reduction in humanitarian and development funding and programs. UNHCR, for example, which should be the main international organization supporting Afghan refugees, is facing an immense shortage in its funds overall, but also for Afghanistan. UNHCR has said that it requires $478 million for its 2025 Afghanistan emergency response, but as of late September 25, has only received 35% of what it needs, a significant funding gap. The funds are used to provide emergency assistance like shelter, food, water, and cash to vulnerable Afghans and refugees, returnees, both within Afghanistan and neighboring countries. But these cuts in official development assistance, ODA, and the pressure of the returns and deportations, you can imagine how tough it is. All other UN agencies with a presence in Afghanistan, including UNICEF, the organization I worked with for over 3 decades, international NGOs, local NGOs, Afghan businessmen, families, have all been engaged in trying their best to support these deportees and returnees. But it is the bare minimum for most. I have been in touch with colleagues regularly about this, and I know they're trying their best, but the needs are way beyond that. It is indeed a particularly difficult moment in time, and we are witness to serious backlashes in many sectors with unimaginable impact on the lives of millions of individuals in the region and beyond. Some of those who have been deported are now trying to finalize their Afghan ID cards and documentations, and reapplying or applying for Iranian work permits and visas so they can return. And we will see how many that is possible. For example, a case I know through friends, a young man who dug wells outside Tehran in a place called Damavan, was caught once, set free through the intervention of his Iranian employer, and then caught a second time and sent back, deported, leaving behind his young 16-year-old Afghan wife who was 7 months pregnant at that time. The child is now born, of course, without any citizenship or ID, and the couple are desperately hoping he can return sooner rather than later. Otherwise, she and the child will have to return to Afghanistan as well. And there are literally thousands of stories like that, much worse or like that. Apparently, Iran is now facing a labor shortage, or rather cheap labor shortage, because of this deportation, and has more recently announced that it will give 200,000 work visas to Afghan laborers. and has been in discussion with the Taliban authorities regarding this matter and the overall plight of Afghans in Iran. But nevertheless, the threat, sense of insecurity continues for Afghans unabated in Iran. And an Afghan friend told me only yesterday how her mother back in Iran is even scared to go to the mosque or in fact most any other public space. Another friend mentioned how in a park that used to be very popular with Afghan families, now you see none anymore. And many other such anecdotes, unfortunately. Just today, I heard from an Iranian friend, a retired UNHCR staff member, and then read in the media that many Iranians now object to reports of a new bill reportedly under consideration in the Iranian parliament that would grant citizenship to foreigners like Afghans and Iraqis if they enter into temporary Shiite marriage, sireh, with an Iranian woman. As you can imagine, this has dire consequences for Iranian girls and women potentially involved in such arrangements, and is only another dimension of the serious gendered repercussions of all such policies and actions. As always, what is needed, and in fact is needed more than ever now, and Iranians like myself advocate for, and which is why I wanted to share with you, is one, an immediate end to this inhuman, undignified expulsion by Iran and Pakistan, whether its initial mass grand scale or its current size down manner. Two, return of Afghans, assets, jobs, schooling opportunities, and otherwise as possible in Iran and Pakistan. Three, provision of humanitarian assistance to those affected, deported, especially children, women, minorities, and families. Four, advocacy, continued advocacy by UN, UNHCR, and others with the Iranian and Pakistani governments to halt these actions and find medium and long-term sustainable rights-based solutions. Five, provide support to Afghan organizations, especially Afghan women's organizations, to work alongside progressive Iranian and Pakistani organizations and other organizations at all levels, and build bridges, solidarity, and greater understanding in line with international human rights conventions and agreements. And of course, being here at the Center for Refugee Studies in Canada, finally, six, Canadian government and NGOs, civil society organizations, academia continue, maintain, increase their support of Afghans in Afghanistan, in the region, and in Canada. The lives of millions of Afghans is at stake, especially for Iran. Our futures are interlinked. And how Iran treats Afghans and Afghan refugees is also a reflection of how Iranians are themselves treated by the government. And I feel the aspirations for human rights, freedom, and independence, which is strong amongst both Afghans and Iranians, and our civil society organizations and social movements cannot be separated from one another. We can be strong and succeed together, or continue to live the fraught lives of the present. It's a choice. I think this is all the time we have now, and I look forward to hearing from you all, learning from you, and further sharing our experiences and perspectives in the hope of finding more humane and human rights-based ways forward together. Thank you.